Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. This week we have part one of our interview with Marek Kiczkowiak from TEFL Equity Advocates, and this week he talks about native speakerism, English as a lingua franca, IELTS examiners having to take the IELTS exam, and labelling terminologies in ELT. So enjoy. So hello and welcome to a special episode of Phrasally Verbocious podcast. Today joining us we have the ELT celebrity himself, Marek Kiczkowiak from TEFL Equity Advocates. Welcome, Marek. Could you tell everybody a little about yourself?
Hi everybody. First of all, I'm not a celebrity. At least I don't feel like one. But thanks for having me, guys. I run TEFL Equity Advocates and Academy, where I help English teachers tackle native speakerism, or this idea that any native speaker is superior linguistically and pedagogically, and also helping English teachers teach English for global communication. And I'm sure we'll get into both subjects here on the podcast. So thanks again, guys, for having me.
Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Very welcome.
Right now, I'm currently holding your Teaching English as a Lingua Franca book. Could you tell us a little bit about what English as a Lingua Franca is?
Sure. You can think, I think one of the best ways to think about it, especially in terms of practical implications, is to think of it as a third paradigm or as a set of pedagogical beliefs and principles that will inform what you do in the classroom. So, in other words, if English is a global language, an international language that is mostly used by those who don't speak it as the first language, this has some really important implications for what we should do in the classroom. And this teaching English as a lingua franca would be different from teaching English as a foreign or as a second language. And when I mean teaching ELF or English as a lingua franca, I don't mean it in the sense that you're teaching a variety of English. That's one of common misconceptions about ELF, that it's a variety of English. It's a thing that you teach. I mean, mind you, British English or Irish English is not a thing that has a set of defined characteristics. As well, it continues to change, right? But when I say teaching English as a lingua franca, I mean a set of pedagogical principles that inform what you do in the classroom, and these principles are based on research about how people communicate, how people use English in international contexts.
Yeah. I think one of the most important things you just said there was the last thing, where it's international context. So certain exam bodies will mark students on international intelligibility as opposed to a more traditional, do they sound like they're from London sort of thing. Do you see teaching English as moving towards that in general? Or are they fighting off the old course book idea?
I think, the change is happening, but the change is slow, and it won't take years. It will take decades before, before this change actually happens, because there's a lot of different attitudes and factors and levels of change that you need to consider, right? There is students and their attitudes, there's teachers, there's teacher trainers, coursebook writers, publishers, language school owners, right? But I think definitely this change is happening right now, and it has already started in some schools, in some course books, in some teachers are already implementing this change as well.
Can we pick up on one of those groups of stakeholders actually, and just because you're mentioning the different perspectives there might be. I'm interested in asking you, about students. Deliberately, students/customers, and this perception that they want a certain thing. Maybe you could say a few things about that.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of research that shows that, some students do prefer what they perceive to be a standard native speaker accent. So just as a shorthand, I will be often here talking about native speaker accent or native speaker pronunciation. But when I say that, really what I mean is this perceived standard native speaker voice. I don't mean any native speaker pronunciation, because there's a lot of prejudice and bias as well when it comes to, different native speaker accents. So, the interesting thing though is that, for example, in some studies, students prefer a native speaker voice when they are explicitly told that this is a native speaker. And in fact, students are very bad at recognizing who is a native speaker and who isn't. In many studies, as few as 50%, as little as 50% of the participants recognize a voice as a native speaker voice. And it's only when they recognize it as a native speaker voice that they prefer it. Or when they are told that, look, now this is a native speaker voice, then they express a preference for it, right? And again, if they hear a certain accent that they just, for some reason, they don't like, they haven't been exposed to, they might just say, well, I don't like it, even if it's a native speaker voice. And I think it's really also important to acknowledge that, all these perceptions that students might have and teachers might have about what is the correct, in inverted commas, of course, correct pronunciation, it's all based on ideology. It's based on how we've marketed the English language. The English language has been marketed as a property of a certain prestigious group in the UK, and now more so in the US as well, right? Yeah. And this obviously has disenfranchised many native speakers who don't belong to this narrow group of native speakers who speak with a prestigious accent, but it's also disenfranchised many non-native speakers. And if for decades in many course books, in teaching courses, the accent that you heard was standard British pronunciation or general American pronunciation, I mean, clearly, we shouldn't be surprised that most students want to continue listening to this.
Because it's what they're used to hearing.
Absolutely, and it's what whenever we teach pronunciation, we play the recording of the standard native speaker voice, and we tell students repeat. So they think they should sound like this recording, because we've never kind of tried to disrupt this status quo and tell them, like, look, there are other accents. Where I come from, we speak like this, and it's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong.
Well, that's what. Before we started recording, I'm sorry to speak for you, Alan, but Alan was apologizing for his accent.
But I do that to everyone I meet.
but why do you do that?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's different where I'm from, because I'm slightly ashamed of where I'm from. But that's political. That's not to do with speakers.
Well, it's all political, isn't it? In a way.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I would say, if you think about it, Alan, no speaker of RP or standard British English, or no speaker of standard American English would ever think that it would be appropriate to apologize for their accent, or to say, like, well, sorry if I sound like this. They would never say that. Because I think anyone who's in the position of power assumes that their position is the default and everybody else should be like them. And those who are, kind of at the bottom, many kind of either apologize, or they kind of want to move up this artificially created ladder of prestige and speak with that prestigious accent.
I think it's quite interesting where you said, the studies of students didn't know the accent until they were either told it was, a native speaker or from somewhere else. One of the really interesting things from your book was you had one of the lessons is the why is English a global language, and it introduced the circles of English. So the inner circle, the outer circle, expanding circle, and that kind of thing. And then there was the brief history of English in the book as well. I did this with an FCE class last year, B2 level, and I found it very interesting how I think there is like a generational knowledge in the classroom of who is aware of this and who isn't. So I had a class that were mainly all sort of retired geography teachers. So more naturally, they were fully aware of this. They were, they quite understood this. I had videos of a lot of different people around the world talking in English. But then I had university students who had no awareness of this at all. It was a class of 10 university students studying for the B2. Do you think it's something to do with, I don't know, is it education, or is it their awareness of the language and where it goes or where it's used? Because they were quite surprised when we were doing, like Nigerian English, and, South African English. So say like stuff David Crystal has talked about, where he's like, in South Africa, a robot is a traffic light. It was a brand new thing to them when they were, looking at the circles of English. I was quite surprised that the university generation weren't very aware of that.
I think in my experience, whenever I've done these activities or raised these issues with students, I'd say that the majority is not aware of it. There's always a few students that have heard about it, but there is this deeply ingrained idea that English or the correct English, quote unquote, is spoken in Britain and America, and that's about it, right? And I think students start to realize that this is obviously false when you start bringing in those topics into the classroom. But I think there is still not enough of it. I think there are still very few teachers globally who address these issues on a regular basis. So I think it's probably, you could do a whole class on it, but I think, these issues could be raised, for 2 minutes every other class. Whenever you, for example, do pronunciation, rather than have one accent, you could have 3 different accents and maybe even 2 of them non-native speakers, and ask your students, well, which accent do you prefer? Or where are these people from? Who would you like to sound like? Would you like to sound like this person or like this person? Why? And you're not even kind of imposing any views on your students. You don't have to express your opinion. You just, put it out there to them. And I think if you do it often enough, there will be some light bulbs switching on. But then if we don't do that, then, the status quo will just continue.
Yeah.
I think it's important whenever I'm teaching, because I teach in Spain, and at least here there is the concept of 2 different Spanishes. So in the sense, well, more than 2, but the idea of Latin American Spanish and Castellano here. So when it's quite easy to give them a pointer about, okay, well, actually that's an example of American English, that's an example of British English, but that's still not enough in terms of broadening the picture, and I realize that. But I do think that does help, because there's already a concept of, Spanish isn't just what's spoken here. But I suppose in other countries it's different to that.
Marek, there's a really interesting thing in the book, which I've been dying to talk to you about, which I think is just mind-blowing. So there's an interesting point you raise. It's page 94 and 95 in the English as Lingua Franca book, where it talks about IELTS test results, and L1 speakers score an average of 6.5, which is a borderline B2 C1, with 42% of L1 English speakers scoring below that level, and only 1% of them that take the test score a native like, if you will, IELTS 9.0 on the test. I think this is just an amazing statistic, and aside from that being almost disturbing, what do you think's the significance of this? Because my exam classes that I had, who took the B2 and the C1 exams, I actually typed those results into a PowerPoint slide and left it on the screen, because they're all a wee bit paranoid about the speaking. Everybody's nervous about doing a speaking exam, and they were all a bit nervous about that, especially going up against like a Cambridge Examiner or a Trinity Examiner. And I basically said, read that, relax. But as well as trying to make my students feel a bit more relaxed, that is an amazing statistic.
I think it is. I think it's very revealing. And obviously it's from 2015. I haven't looked at 2019 results to sort of give you more up-to-date statistics. But I think it's very revealing, because there is this idea that many people have that any native speaker is infallible in their own language. They're omniscient in their own language. They just know their own language, and many native speakers use this, to sell their courses. Schools use it to sell their courses, by saying that, if you have classes with a native speaker, they know their language, they know, they've been brought up in it, they have an intuitive knowledge of collocation and everything. And surely, whenever I give these statistics, surely, people could say, well, yes, but we have to look at which native speakers take this test. Surely there might be, they might have lower education, for example, and so on. Perhaps some people who indicated their first language is English aren't actually native speakers, and so on. You can come up with all sorts of justifications for this.
Yeah.
But still, I think it's just very, very revealing, this statistic. And I think, we have to really question this idea that any native speaker is sort of at the pinnacle of language acquisition, that they're somehow omniscient in the first language, and then they're so much more proficient than any non-native speaker can ever dream of becoming. It's just absolute nonsense if you think about it. It's a completely nonsensical idea. And if you think about, proficiency itself, there are different aspects of proficiency. And, say I teach a lot of academic English. This is the only thing that I teach at the moment, especially academic writing. Nobody is a native speaker of academic writing. I have native speakers who come to my courses, and they're no better than the non-native speakers on that course. They're equally good or bad, right? They literally have zero idea how to write a paper, which isn't surprising because they've never written a paper. They know the language, but they don't even know how to use it appropriately in that particular context because they've never done it.
You're teaching genre as much as you're teaching language, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah. You're explaining to them how to do this particular task. So I think this idea as well that as a non-native speaker, you always have to prove your proficiency. As a native speaker, you never ask that. It's always assumed that you're good enough. As a non-native speaker, you're always assumed to be not good enough, right? And I think this is a very discriminatory idea. To give you a personal example, how far this can go, when I applied for my PhD at the University of York, I was told I would have to prove my proficiency and take the IELTS exam. And I told them, well, look, but I've been an IELTS examiner for the last 4 years. You really expect me to take an IELTS exam? This would be quite strange, wouldn't it? But they were like, no, well, you're from Poland. You're a non-native speaker. We need a proof of your proficiency. It doesn't matter that you've been teaching English for the previous 10 years, that you've been an IELTS examiner and you've got these qualifications.
That's extraordinary.
Guess what? If I was from any native-speaking country, that would never have been the question. Even if my proficiency in English was on IELTS band 6 or something like this, that doesn't matter because I have the right passport, right? And I think it's a crazy idea when, as well, when we move back to teaching, when, you've got CELTA qualified teachers or you've got Delta qualified teachers with a master's degree in English language teaching. And when they want to say, emigrate to a native speaking country, they want to find a job in a particular country, they need to prove their proficiency. Whereas, you've got an 18-year-old native speaker who's just finished a CELTA course, has as much idea about language and teaching that language as, a 5-year-old does, really. Let's be honest. And they don't have to prove anything,
because they wield their passport and they get a job.
Absolutely. And I think it's bonkers if you think about that.
What was the outcome when you showed them that you were an IELTS examiner?
Well, in the end, that didn't matter. I would still have had to take IELTS, but fortunately, my dad reminded me that I had done the CPE way before, and that never expires. That certificate. Yeah. They still at the beginning didn't want to accept it because they were like, no, it's IELTS or nothing. But in the end, I can't remember what happened, but they did accept my
I just think, CPE. Just thinking ethically, that's extraordinary, asking an IELTS examiner to take the exam that they examine.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, aside from the other points about the fact that your proficiency is obviously good enough to do a PhD, surely that's ethically sketchy to take the exam that you examine.
Absolutely, it is. It is.
Madness.
That's extraordinary.
Madness,
But it's interesting. I mean, if you don't mind me adding an anecdote from a different perspective as well, is that this idea that natives are somehow naturally proficient. I find it all the time here. I live with Spanish people, and sometimes I'll ask them, did I make a mistake there, or what's this? Is this now masculine or feminine? Because I really struggle to keep the difference between el and la, and I'll stump them, like, it's this, and kind of look a little bit confused for a moment, because speaking a language natively, even if they would use the correct gender when they're just talking naturally, when they're asked about it, they don't necessarily know. And so this idea that then they could rock up in a non-Spanish speaking country with their Spanish passport and just teach Spanish because they're a native speaker, like, is obviously not very sound, because actually knowing about the language is what you need in order to teach it. It's extraordinary.
And even just sort of the proficiency itself, even if we don't think about the language awareness. To give you another example, I'm sure you've guys seen Casa del Papel.
Yeah.
The money heist, I think it's called in English, right? And my girlfriend is from Costa Rica, right? And we both speak Spanish to each other, and we watch it with subtitles, and we read the subtitles, and we still have no idea what they said.
Yes.
And she's an educated native speaker of Spanish who's doing a PhD now, and she still doesn't know what they're saying. And another example, I was recently translating a proposal for academic writing courses that I was sending to a Spanish-speaking university, and it had to be in Spanish. So I was translating from English, and she was sitting across me at the table. So I'd be, I'll use her native-speaking knowledge of Spanish to ask her questions. And I was like, honey, how do you say research gap in Spanish? And she was looking at me, research gap? I don't know. Okay, how do you say the aim of this proposal is? I don't know. Why don't you use a dictionary?
It's exactly the same thing as you were saying about teaching academic writing in English. Just because someone's proficient in the language doesn't mean they have the knowledge to write a proposal for an academic proposal. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Lately on Instagram, you mentioned we should rename, or you were talking about renaming the terms native English teacher and non-native English teacher. And I was wondering, would a term change actually change anything at all, as possibly a new term might cause discrimination again? I'm just asking this because, apologizing for my accent, could this go down a path similar to sort of what happens here in the north of Ireland, where one community gets preferred for employment over another, even though no company is ever going to say that publicly. But depending on how you pronounce, say, the letter H in the alphabet, or what sport you're interested in, what primary or high school you went to, or even your postcode, that's normally how they positively discriminate. Would a name change to native and non-native English teacher turn into a new definition problem, or is there a way we can do this where it's neutral, if that makes sense? If we're not saying one or the other, or do we just have to call each other teachers?
Yeah. So I think that I personally think that just changing the labels to other labels, and many labels have been proposed by academics over the years. I don't think that's per se going to change anything. So say if you stop talking about people of color and white people, or black people and white people, this isn't really going to change racism in the world. I think that's, it might help slightly, but it's not really how this systemic discrimination is going to change. Yeah. Having said that, I think there are places where I see no room for the two labels. So say, for example, in job ads, I think they should just say an English teacher. We need a qualified English teacher. We need somebody who has IELTS, at least IELTS 8, And everybody, including those who come from native speaking countries, is required to provide a proof of their proficiency, whether you like it or not. I think this is the only way to make it egalitarian. In the way schools advertise themselves is completely inappropriate, in my opinion, as it would be inappropriate to talk about having black and white teachers. I think it's inappropriate to say we've got native and non-native speaker teachers. We've got qualified English teachers. That's the appropriate way to market your school. I see time and time again on Instagram, YouTube, these teachers who their unique selling point is being a native speaker. And I think, this is just really sad, because if the only thing of value that you can offer is being a native speaker, then it's very sad. But B, it further perpetuates native speakerism. It perpetuates this idea that, native speakers are better teachers, right? Because you're using these prejudices to market yourself. And I think that's wrong as well. Now, on the other hand, there are some places where I think, the use of the labels might still be useful. For example, in academic research, right? When we want to pinpoint the problem and talk about the discrimination that non-native speakers might face, for example, in terms of job opportunities. I guess we could talk about second language English users. We could use another term, but I don't really see what difference this would make. And in there, it is useful because, we are questioning the term. Like, for example, Adrian Holiday has done a lot to question and talk about the so-called native and non-native speaker teachers. There, I think it's still quite useful.
Yeah, I'm just thinking this. I haven't prepared this thought. I'm just thinking in reflection to what you were saying as well. I think it kind of goes hand in hand as well with a very, not necessarily, but it seems to go hand in hand with a sort of a monolingual English approach, or way of thinking as well. And so this idea that you're a native or you're a non-native of English, well, we know that multilingualism is much more of a norm in the world than monolingualism. And this idea that somebody is a native teacher also kind of has this implication that they're only going to be using English. And any of the nuances or things of the local language, or that they may have actually more. I'm a native speaker of English, but it's not my only language, and it certainly isn't my only native language. And this idea that somehow that gets privileged over other aspects of my linguistic repertoire or the linguistic repertoire of other teachers. I don't know what point I'm trying to make, but I think I was interested in what you were saying, and that was like making my brain fire on that issue. Like, I don't think because I think it simplifies it down to, this person has English, this person has acquired English, along a path, and never the twain shall meet. And it's not that simple, because we've all got different linguistic resources, and even the whole academic writing aspect of it, that actually maybe native speakers would be not used to doing themselves, even if they were teachers, because it's another aspect to the language. It isn't just this whole monolithic thing. Sorry, there's not a question in there. That was just maybe Alan has to cut this, but I was just reflecting on that.
Well, I think it's the similarities between books that use the term learner or use the term user, and then it's like when you see certain academies that English only in an L1 classroom or a monolingual classroom. I think those two sort of merge into each other. Like, I've worked in academies where it's like in Spain, where it's like under no circumstances speak Spanish, but everybody's Spanish in the room. Of course I'm going to.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's what Kahru, I think it was Kahru who called it the monolingual fallacy, right? He debunked the whole native speaker myth, referring to different fallacies. And one of them is a monolingual fallacy, that, a native speaker is monolingual, and then they will not use the student's first language, and as a result, there'll be more exposure to the language and stuff like this. But this is, the whole idea is bonkers as well. I think it's, it's mad as well, because there are so many advantages to being able to speak the student's first language. Obviously, on a low level, it's completely necessary to be able to explain certain things, or to make comparisons between the two languages, to translate things very quickly. And if you think about it, translation and multilingualism, switching between languages, is something that we do all the time. I mean, here at home, we speak Polish, English, and Spanish, and we switch between the three kind of all the time. We say, you know, bizarre things really sometimes, but, you know, the idea that somehow I only have to stick to one language could only have been invented by somebody who's monolingual. I mean, that idea would have never arisen, say, in Africa, where 99% of people are super multilingual, right?
Yeah.
It could have only arisen in the mind of a monolingual speaker.
So thanks for listening to part one of our interview with Marek. Next week, he will be back talking to us about informing students on teacher qualifications, teacher nightmares, racism in ELT, and what you can do about it. So long, follow.